you know what the most frightening thing in the world is?
Welcome to episode 57 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring voyeurism, meta-commentary, and the world of the snuff movie, with one film that, according to its director, ruined his career, and another that launched the career of its director. First up, we have Peeping Tom from 1960, directed by Michael Powell. It stars Karl Böhm, Anna Massey, Moira Shearer, and Maxine Audley. Then we follow this with the debut feature from acclaimed director Alejandro Amenábar. This is Tesis, or Thesis, from 1996, and it stars Ana Torrent, Eduardo Noriega, Fele Martínez, and Nieves Herranz. Along the way, we'll be discussing the career of Michael Powell and the critical mauling that Peeping Tom and Powell received from the critics, the depiction of so-called snuff movies in cinema, the early life of Alejandro Amenábar, and much, much more. But before we do any of that, though, I'd just like to mention the main sources that I've used in researching this week's episode, and of course, all sources will be listed or linked in the show notes. So when discussing Peeping Tom, I have heavily referenced the book Peeping Tom by Kiri Bloom Walden, which was published as part of the Devil's Advocate series of books. I've also referred to interviews and extras on the Blu-ray release of the film from Studio Canal, a 1997 documentary called A Very British Psycho, and interviews and articles on the websites medium.com, bbfc.co.uk, powellpressburger.org, planetinterview.de, and criterion.com. And when discussing Tesis, I have referred to interviews, commentaries, and extras on the Blu-ray release of the film from Umbrella Entertainment, and the books Spanish Horror Film by Antonio Lazaro Ribol, The Spanish Fantastic by Sheila Rowan-Legg, Supranational Horrors by Rui M. Tridade Oliveira, and Nightmare Movies by Kim Newman. And I've also referred to interviews and articles on the websites madridmarsd.org, academiacine.com, cadenza.com, and hollywood.com. And of course, I've also referred to the IMDb and Wikipedia pages for the movie's cast and crew. Peeping Tom from director Michael Powell is perhaps one of the most notorious British horror films ever made, and today is possibly as equally famous for the critical mauling it received on its initial screening as it is for its actual content. Filmed in 1959 and released in 1960, just a few months before Psycho, the revulsion expressed by the British critics was so extreme that it was effectively pulled from general release in the UK, denying the great British public the opportunity to make up their own minds. The Monthly Film Bulletin compared Michael Powell to the Marquis de Sade. The Evening Standard said that it was clever but corrupt and loathsome. The Daily Express called it nauseating and depressing. The Observer described it as beastly, and Tribune magazine suggested that, quote, the only satisfactory way to dispose of Peeping Tom would be to shovel it up and flush it swiftly down the nearest sewer, end quote. Even director Terence Fisher, whose own Curse of Frankenstein for Hammer Films had hardly delighted these very same critics, was concerned about the film's content, conceding that while it was indeed very well made, it was incredibly hard to support, and was also possibly, quote-unquote, dangerous. One of the reasons for this, perhaps, was the status of the director himself. Michael Powell, who had started his career in 1925, had, along with his creative partner Emmerich Pressburger, been responsible for films quite rightly regarded as classics of British cinema. These include 1943's The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, A Matter of Life and Death, released in 1946, Black Narcissus, released in 1947, and The Red Shoes, which was released in 1948. Although by the time of Peeping Tom his career had taken a slight downward trajectory, for many of the critics this new film seemed the ultimate betrayal. This is perhaps best summed up by the review from the newspaper The Daily Worker, which said that they were, quote, shocked to the core to find a director of his standing befouling the screen with such perverted nonsense. It wallows in the diseased urges of a homicidal pervert. It uses phony camera artifice and heavily orchestral music to whip up a debased atmosphere. From its lumbering, mildly salacious beginning to its appallingly masochistic and depraved climax, it is wholly evil. End quote. Well, as we all know by now, there's nothing that the British press enjoys more than a bit of shock and hyperbole. These days, of course, notices like these would have had audiences lining up around the block, and distributors would pay good money for that kind of attention and publicity. But for distributors Anglo-amalgamated, it was all far too much. Michael Powell would later say that the critical mauling panicked the studio head Nat Cohen, and there's been much speculation that Cohen was also worried that a scandal would get in the way of a much-hoped-for knighthood. As Powell later reflected to the writer Bill Kelly, Cohen pulled the film from release after just 5 days. Quote, I said to him, you're pulling it. Over what? Bad reviews? You stand by your film. You weather the storm. But he was a coward, and his mind was made up. End quote. Part of the legend is that the film completely destroyed Powell's career, though, as I mentioned earlier, his career had been on a downward trajectory in any case. But it's certainly true that, after its release, Powell himself noted that it marked the end of his relationship with financiers and distributors. As he said in later interviews, quote, the film truly ruined me, end quote. Michael Powell was born in the county of Kent, England in 1905 and entered the film industry in 1925, working with the director Rex Ingram in Nice, France. The introduction had been facilitated by Powell's father, Thomas, who owned a hotel in the city, and so Powell began working at the Victorine Studios, first as a studio runner and then progressing to other roles, including stills photography and writing the intertitles for silent movies. He also did some minor acting work, making his screen debut in 1926 in a silent fantasy horror called The Magician, purportedly based on the life of controversial occultist Aleister Crowley. Returning to England in 1926, he continued working in the film industry, including as a stills photographer for Alfred Hitchcock, with whom he would remain friends until Hitchcock died in 1980. In addition to stills photography, he also began script writing before beginning his directing career with a series of short, very low-budget films known as quota quickies. We've discussed the idea of quota quickies quite a few times now, but just as a reminder, these were hour-long movies made to satisfy the legal requirement for British cinemas to show a certain number of British films. Many of the great British directors, including David Lean and Terence Fisher, also got their start on such productions. And so Powell's first screen credit as a director came in 1931 with a comedy drama called 2 Crowded Hours, and over the next 5 years he directed 23 further films. Well, they didn't call them quickies for nothing. His first major project came in 1937 with a film called The Edge of the World, and this was about the depopulation of one of the isolated outer islands off Scotland, as one by one the younger generation began to leave for greater opportunities offered by the mainland. When it was released in the US, it received a largely positive review from Variety, which felt that, while the film was overlong, it boasted very good performances from the central cast and excellent photography, which depicted, quote, the grim, eerie, storm-bound islet in its ever-varying moods, end quote. This film changed the trajectory of Powell's career, and he was hired by the producer Alexander Korda, who brought him in to save a project called The Spy in Black. This starred the actor Conrad Veidt, who we'll be talking about next week, and also received incredibly good reviews. The Monthly Film Bulletin wrote that the intricate story was gripping from beginning to end and very skillfully directed, while the New York Times said that it was the most exciting spy melodrama since the advent of the Second World War. More importantly, during pre-production, Powell met a man called Emmerich Pressburger, a screenwriter who had been brought in to help with the story and who, according to Powell, completely restructured the film. They would make 2 more films together with Powell directing and Pressburger acting as screenwriter, and these were Contraband in 1940 and the Oscar-nominated 49th Parallel in 1941. And at this point they decided to combine their talents and form a production company that they referred to as the Archers. With Powell and Pressburger working together as co-producers, writers and directors, the Archers would make 19 features, many of which, as I mentioned, have gone on to be regarded as classics. Their first film under the new company, 1942's One of Our Aircraft is Missing, was Oscar-nominated for Best Screenplay, and they followed this with films including Black Narcissus in 1947 and The Red Shoes in 1948, which would go on to become one of the highest-earning British films of all time. But much like Peeping Tom, not all of these were without their own controversies. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, released in 1943, was criticised at the time of its release because of its sympathetic depiction of a German officer, albeit an anti-Nazi one. It even provoked an extremist pamphlet written by a pair of right-wing sociologists who called it, quote, the most disgraceful production that has ever emanated from a British film studio, end quote. Meanwhile, Black Narcissus, released in 1947, was condemned in the US by the Catholic National Legion of Decency, which said that the film was an affront to religious life and that it described religion as, quote, an escape for the abnormal, the neurotic, and the frustrated, end quote. But all good things must come to an end, and across the 1950s, changing tastes in British cinema led to creative differences. By now, the new wave of British kitchen sink dramas had begun to take over from the more opulent cinema with which they had made their name, and the two began to pull in opposite directions. Powell preferred to hold on to stylized fantasy and romanticism, while Pressburger wanted to focus on more grounded and naturalistic realism. When Powell was asked about this later, he said, quote, well, we'd run out of ideas. We'd done a couple of films that were based on real events. One was called The Battle of the River Plate, and that was a success. And then we did another one based on the real kidnapping of a German general in Crete called Ill Met by Moonlight. And I couldn't do anything with it. I just couldn't bring anything interesting to it because I didn't like being tied down to the facts. I resisted the realism and Emmerich embraced it. So it was on the basis of this difference in approach that we just sort of drifted apart. It was just a sad creative gap that opened up between two loving people, end quote. Following the split, Powell travelled to Spain to make a film called Honeymoon, a project which he hoped would do for Spanish flamenco what the Red Shoes had done for ballet. It won the technical prize at the 1959 Cannes Film Festival, but was not as successful as his films with Pressburger. The production was also rather difficult, if not a little bit jinxed. There were significant financial problems, and worse, during production, Powell's car was stolen. As the thieves were chased, they crashed the car, and both died as a result. Returning to England, Powell began to look for a new project and a new screenwriting partner. A producer friend introduced him to a man called Leo Marx, who had worked as a cryptographer during the Second World War. Barely in his 20s at the time of the war, but a mathematical genius, many of Marx's ciphers took the form of poems because they would be easy for agents to learn and commit to memory. His story and his activities during the war are absolutely fascinating, but sadly I don't have time to go into them here. But I do highly recommend that if you're interested, you watch the documentary A Very British Psycho, which is all about Leo Marx and of course the making of Peeping Tom, and I'll link it in the show notes for anyone who wants to watch it. After the war, Marx took his writing a stage further, and he began writing plays, including 1946's The Girl Couldn't Quite and 1957's The Best Damn Lie. He also began writing film scripts, including a crime drama called Cloudburst, which was released in 1950. Hitting it off with Powell, Marx began pitching ideas. But the first two, one about a double agent and the other about Sigmund Freud, never really got off the ground. But Marx, whose time as a cryptographer during the war had led to a fascination with the idea of looking, also had another idea in mind. He had always wanted to tell the story of a voyeur, from their beginnings as a little boy to the moment of their death. In one of his autobiographies, $1 Million Movie, Powell recalled the moment that Marx suggested the basic premise, saying that he, quote, sat down, leant towards me, fixed me with a penetrating gaze, and said, "Mr. Powell, how would you like to make a film about a young man with a camera who kills the women that he photographs?" And I said, "That's me. I'd like it very much." End quote. All of which brings us on to our first film of the week, which is, of course, Peeping Tom. Directed by Michael Powell from a screenplay written by Leo Marx, it stars Karl Böhm, Anna Massey, Moira Shearer, and Maxine Audley. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so all my usual warnings apply from here on in. The Daily Worker may well have described the opening of Peeping Tom as lumbering and mildly salacious, but in reality this could not be further from the truth. In fact, I would venture to say that it was within the first 10 minutes of the film that the critics made up their minds, and that their perspective on everything that followed is nothing more or less than a classic example of confirmation bias. We begin on an almost deserted London street, which is filmed in Eastman colour to give it an incredibly saturated and almost theatrical appearance. In fact, as Kiri Bloom notes in her excellent book about the film published for Devil's Advocates, although Peeping Tom used real-life locations as well as studio sets, it's actually very difficult to tell them apart, because the lighting of locations, such as Newman Passage, the scene of the opening murder, makes it all look incredibly artificial. Newman Passage, a narrow cobbled street located a 5-minute walk from Tottenham Court Road in London, has been described as, quote, veritably dripping with Victorian atmosphere, end quote, and has been used as the location for several TV shows and films. More recently, Edgar Wright used it as a location in his giallo-esque Last Night in Soho, choosing the setting as a deliberate homage to Peeping Tom. It was also, at the time of filming, the haunt of many London sex workers, which grounded the film in the reality of the period, even if it is presented in an impressionistic style. Aside from the dreamlike and artificial atmosphere, what made this opening so unique for its time was the use of subjective camera, a device that went on to become a signature of the Italian giallo and then the American slasher. In fact, probably for this very reason, Peeping Tom has been called by many a proto-slasher film. We discussed a very early use of this technique when we covered the spiral staircase several episodes ago. And interestingly, this scene begins in a very similar fashion to the subjective viewpoints of that movie, a gigantic close-up of an eye that opens and stares directly into the camera. And although we don't know it yet, this opening shot sets up one of the central ideas of the movie, because if nothing else, Peeping Tom, as its title suggests, is a film that is all about voyeurism, or, as it is referred to by a psychiatrist later in the movie, the clinical term scopophilia. The spiral staircase and a couple of experimental films aside, Peeping Tom is probably one of the earliest films to use the subjective camera to such an extent and to such an effect. And this is also possibly one of the reasons that the critics of the day found it so distasteful. Almost unheard of for the time, Powell and cinematographer Otto Heller placed the audience into the eyes of a killer. Or perhaps not quite, because the term subjective camera is here quite literal. We see the first victim and the murder not through the eyes of our killer Mark, but through the lens of his camera, though one might argue these could be one and the same thing. This act of audience killer identification must have been disorientating and shocking for viewers of the day. And so, given this perspective, we approach a sex worker played by Brenda Bruce, who greets us coldly with the line, "It'll be £2," before leading us down the passage and up the stairs to her rooms. It is a bold and audacious opening, made all the more so by the sex worker's bored and mechanical expression as she undresses. One that is replaced by abject terror as she sees something happening off-camera of which we are unaware. Something shines and flickers over her face. She draws back, suddenly vulnerable, and then screams as she is murdered, though how and by what we do not entirely know. Because, much like the other deaths in the movie, the murder itself happens off-camera. And this is due, in this case, to the framing of the image itself, whereas later they take place off-screen altogether, as the scenes which immediately precede them fade to black. A shocking opening then, no warm-up, no lead-in. We are immediately in London's seedy underbelly and the eyewitness or participant in a brutal killing. And before we can even take a breath, we are forced to relive it again, this time projected in black and white on a movie screen as our still unseen killer watches the footage and the opening credits roll. The score that accompanies it, composed and directed by Brian Easdale, is an aggressive and propulsive piano refrain, which suggests the interior compulsions of our killer, who we are still, as yet, unable to identify. And so, within the first few minutes, we have been forced to relive the same murder twice, once in the first person and the other watching the killer watch the film. But more than this, as we later discover towards the end of the film, the glittering light that crosses the face of every victim is caused by a reflective device attached to the camera, forcing each of them to observe their own panicked faces in the moment of death. So, in effect, we are watching someone watching a film of someone who is watching their own death, a complex Russian doll of a narrative device that speaks to the central theme of voyeurism on multiple levels, and also betrays the writer Leo Mark's past as a cryptographer. It is perhaps a little too easy for a modern and jaded viewer to express surprise or outright mockery at the shocked reactions of the critics of the day, but it is important to remember that nothing like this had ever been seen before. And so with this in mind, it is perhaps no wonder that the Evening Standard film critic Alexander Walker would later describe it as being, quote, hit with the world's first snuff film, end quote. But far more is to immediately follow. We are then taken back to the subjective viewpoint behind the camera and back to the scene of the crime. This time it is filmed in more naturalistic daylight as the body of the sex worker is brought unceremoniously from the scene and laid out on a stretcher. Although this is initially shot through the lens of the killer's camera though, we do finally now meet him properly and are, at least in terms of 1960s cinema, rather surprised to see that he is a good-looking young man, tidily dressed, clean-cut, and also apparently incredibly polite. When he is mistaken for a reporter by a bystander who asks him what paper he is from, he smiles and gently replies the Observer, which may go some way towards explaining that paper's vitriolic criticism of the film, but which of course speaks once again to the themes of voyeurism and looking. After all, what does an observer do if not observe? Our killer Mark is played by Karl Böhm, or, as he appears in the credit, the slightly more anglicised Karl Böhm. However, it would appear that he wasn't the director's first choice for the role, as this was originally going to be the actor Lawrence Harvey. But Harvey, who would go on to be nominated for an Oscar for his role in Room at the Top, released in the same year that Peeping Tom began filming, was out of the production's budget, and so Powell decided to go in a different direction instead. And this is probably rather fortunate. While Harvey would undoubtedly have given a fantastic performance, he was already a well-established actor by this stage, and casting a virtual unknown, in Britain anyway, removes the additional security that watching a recognisable face can bring. Because if you are watching a quote-unquote name actor, you are always one step removed from the character, regardless of the strength of their performance. And there is to be no such comfort here. Karl Böhm had made a name for himself in Europe, playing the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph I in a trilogy of films known as the Sissy films. By 1958, though, he was working in Britain on a film called Too Hot to Handle, a crime noir exploitation film directed by Terence Young and starring Hollywood blonde bombshell Jane Mansfield. In interviews, Powell said that he met him by chance, going on to say, quote, He was exactly the right mixture of innocence and completely loony. Very touching, very moving, and it was really, for me, a very passionate and interesting film, all about one man." End quote. His lead actor agreed with this sentiment, recalling that he was immediately fascinated by the script from the very first moment he read it. He would also say, though, that another reason he was attracted to the project was because he was certain that Peeping Tom would launch his international film career, which, as we now know, was not exactly to be the case. Empathising with the character of Mark from the outset, he worked very closely with Powell on the development of the character, and he described this process in a 1997 interview. Quote, "My personal relationship with Michael Powell did help us very much to analyse, to psychoanalyse, and to go into very, very special details of the character. I identified myself totally with this figure. I thought him so deeply sympathetic to me, and I had enormous pity for this human being. One of the reasons that people refused this film so violently was because I played him in such a sympathetic way." End quote. Anna Massey, who plays his love interest Helen, also reflected on this in the same interview, saying that Böhm, Marx and Powell talked about the film not as a horror movie, but as a psychological journey, which she agreed that it was. Quote, "This was a man who was desperately, desperately sick. His sickness happened to be that of a serial killer. Because I had nothing to do with the, in quotes, smutty side of the film, I was only aware of this sensitive, pained, beautiful young man, who I was, in the story, falling in love with." End quote. As Karl Böhm was raised in Germany, his Mark has a slight accent that is never explained in the story, adding to his sense of otherness and also alienation, particularly given that filming took place just 15 years after World War II. And intriguingly, Böhm also saw significant parallels between his character and what had happened in Europe just over a decade before. For him, Mark, who as a child was constantly confronted with death by his father, had a connection to the rise of fascism, namely, quote, that a young generation was so influenced by their ancestors that they followed a man like Hitler and became a generation of murderers themselves. End quote. He also noted that the screenplay was written by a Jewish author, and for him this revealed terrifying parallels to the recent past. His depiction of Mark is sensitive, nuanced, and incredibly complex. When he is behind the camera, as in later scenes with the character of Viv, played by Moira Shearer, or Helen's mother, played by Maxine Audley, he is absolutely terrifying. But away from the camera, he is remarkably childlike and innocent, driven by a compulsion that he doesn't understand and of which he desperately wants to be cured. And as Böhm himself has said, this is doubtless one of the other reasons that the critics were so repelled. For them, it was bad enough that Powell's camera made them stand-ins for the killer in the opening. Now they were expected to empathise with him. As if the opening of the movie had not offended the critics enough, more was to immediately follow, with a depiction of the sordid underbelly of British life that few directors had attempted before. We discover that Mark has a job as what I suppose we would call a pornographer, taking nude photographs of models in a studio located above the local newsagents, photographs that the shop's proprietor sells under the euphemistic name of views. These are purchased by supposedly respectable members of the community, including a man played by Miles Malleson, a British character actor best known for comedic roles, though we last saw him as the menacing hearse driver in the 1945 anthology film Dead of Night. He is interrupted in his purchase by an innocent schoolgirl buying a bar of chocolate, which was clearly intended to be darkly comedic. But once again, one can only imagine that this only heightened the sense of disdain felt by that initial audience. Upstairs, we enter Mark's ersatz studio and meet the model Millie, who greets him at the door with the snide comment, "Oh look, it's Cecil Beaton." She is played by Pamela Green, who was a genuine glamour model of the era, another example of Powell's blending of fiction and reality. Powell first encountered her through a magazine called Camera, which she and her partner published, and he then paid a visit to their studio in London. Green, who had studied at St Martin's School of Art, had designed and painted her studio sets herself, and Powell was so taken with them that they were replicated exactly for this scene in the movie. Green and her partner also advised him on the lamps and cameras that Mark would use when photographing the models, and she also wore her own costumes from her studio in her scenes in this film. Once in the studio, we also see another aspect of Mark's compulsion when he encounters another model, Lorraine, who it is revealed has a hair lip, something that Mark finds fascinating and insists upon photographing. Here we see a sudden switch from the rather unassuming young man who enters the room to somebody who is obsessively fascinated. Although we already know that he is a killer, this is the first time we see the switch between the two aspects of his personality on film. This was one of these scenes that was cut by the BBFC on its initial submission to the censor, as they found the depiction of the model's quote-unquote disfigured face objectionable. Other moments in this scene were also cut, particularly the dialogue in which Millie asks Mark to hide her bruises, something that again the censors objected to, presumably on the grounds of the implication as to where and how she got them. And all of this is within the first 15 minutes of the movie. But Mark is not just a killer and a glamour photographer. He also has a day job, working in a film studio as a focus puller, allowing for some rather pithy commentary about the British film industry and the frustrations of being a director. This is perhaps most explicitly depicted through the pained reaction of the fictional film director as he tries to elicit a convincing performance from his young lead actress, played by Shirley Ann Field. But these scenes are not just there as satire. They instead reveal another theme of what is by now an incredibly multi-layered and complicated narrative. Because while Peeping Tom is of course about murder, childhood trauma and voyeurism, it is also about the nature of filmmaking itself. The scenes on the film set depict what for Powell was the reality of what British filmmaking had become. The cast and crew are tired and bored, actors are interchangeable, and crass commercialism has superseded art. And so Mark, with his director's chair in his home cinema and his obsessive need to photograph everything, can be seen as a stand-in for Michael Powell, and indeed for any cinema director. And indeed, we've already heard that when the character was first described by Marx as a man who kills with his camera, Powell's immediate response was to say, "That's me." This may also be one of the reasons, quality of the film aside, that the movie has become so beloved by directors like Scorsese and Coppola, because what is a director if not a compulsive voyeur? Ana Massey commented on this in her 1997 interview, saying, quote, "Directors have to have that urge to gaze, so in a sense, Mark is the perfect hero for all film directors." End quote. Powell himself certainly identified with this, later saying that Peeping Tom was, quote, "full of compassion for a diabolical murderer, but for me he wasn't a murderer, he was a cameraman," end quote. But for the critics of the day, he took this identification a step too far. When we see the home movies of Mark's childhood and learn of the psychological abuse meted out by his scientist father, it is Powell himself who plays the father figure, and his actual son, Columba Powell, who plays the young Mark. Taking it a step further, in the sequence where the young Mark is shown his dead mother's body to say goodbye, as he calls it, it was also Powell's wife and Columba's mother who played the dead body. This may sound more than a little distasteful, and it certainly was to those who first saw it, but Columba himself found the outrage over his inclusion absolutely hilarious, and later said, quote, "It's only a movie, and Dad was always filming things anyway," end quote. These home movies are introduced during Mark's first proper encounter with Helen, the young and rather naive woman who lives downstairs in the multi-occupancy household. We soon discover that the house was once owned by Mark's father, and that Mark is the mysterious landlord who rents out rooms to others in order to make ends meet. Helen is played by Ana Massey, the daughter of Hollywood legend Raymond Massey, who has starred in, among other things, Arsenic and Old Lace, A Matter of Life and Death, and James Dean's debut feature film, East of Eden. An award-winning actress of stage and screen with a career spanning the years 1955 to 2008, horror fans will also recognise her from her performances in Alfred Hitchcock's Frenzy and the Amicus anthology movie The Vault of Horror, in which her character is murdered by her actor brother, Daniel Massey, only to return, spoiler alert, as a rather vengeful vampire. Peeping Tom was one of her earliest film roles, and she recalls being shocked by both the initial outrage and the film itself when she first saw it, saying that, as she had been kept away from the seedier aspects of the film, she found the finished product rather horrendous. She did go on to say, though, that it clearly wouldn't have become the cult hit that it did if it had been made for the wrong reasons. Quote, "Nobody who said it was a great piece of filmmaking, like Coppola and Scorsese, would have said that if it was just a stalk and slash movie. It wasn't, it was beyond that. That's in its defense. But it is a horrible movie to watch." End quote. Her performance as Helen, who she has described as full of emotion, warmth and innocence, is very good, particularly given the early stage of her career. But she would later say that, on set, she was often genuinely scared as a result of her lack of experience, and also because of the demands of Powell himself. She would later recount that Powell would frequently argue with the camera operator Jerry Turpin before each take, and his desire to film long and complicated shots often had people's nerves on edge, even without his rather fractious approach to filmmaking. But she also conceded that she learned a great deal from the experience, saying, quote, "Like John Ford, Powell believed in setting up the shots carefully, and then when the crew were ready, the actors would return. We would rehearse until Powell was satisfied that he could get his shot in one take. We never did more than 2. Some of the takes were 8 or 9 minutes long, involving extremely intricate tracking. I learned an enormous amount about filmmaking from him. He wasn't easy to work with, but he was a true original and a taskmaster. I think he enabled everyone to give of their best." End quote. It is through Helen that we experience Mark's humanity, not just in the revelations about his abusive childhood, but in all of their interactions. His delight when she brings him a piece of birthday cake is palpable, as is his obvious excitement when she seeks his help with her book project, a children's story about what else but a magic camera. Their tentative romance is sweet, heartbreaking, and of course ultimately doomed. But it also exposes deeper aspects of Mark's voyeurism. Not only does he frequently watch her through her window, but he also studies her as if trying to understand what it is to actually be human, as in the quite brilliant moment where he mirrors her movements as she tries on a brooch he has given her as a birthday gift. We also, of course, fear for her safety, knowing that she is slowly falling in love with a man who she considers to be gentle, but who we know is in fact a compulsive killer. It comes as something of a relief then when later in the movie he tells her that he will never photograph her with his lethal camera, grabbing it out of her hand when she directs its lens towards her own face. It is also through Helen that we meet our other protagonist, her mother, Mrs. Stevens, played by Maxine Audley. She is perhaps the only person in the film, other than his victims, who sees Mark for what he truly is, which is no small irony given the fact that her character is blind. The idea that someone with no vision has the best vision in the film is admittedly a little too neat when watching in hindsight, but it is quite nicely underplayed. Much like the audience, she fears for Helen's safety, leading to a genuinely uncomfortable scene when she goes to visit Mark in his upstairs screening room, a moment in which we fear she may become his next victim. Fortunately, this is not the case, though this sequence does allow for some rather fantastic imagery, as both she and Mark stand before his movie screen, on which he is projecting the silent footage of his latest murder, both of them blending in with the projected image as if they are disappearing into the film itself. Even here, Mrs. Stevens, who cannot see these silent images, knows that something is very wrong, but her initial concerns and terror ultimately give way to empathy, as she implores Mark to get help before it is too late, and then gently runs her hands over his face. "Taking my photograph?" he asks her. The scene that he is projecting is, as I mentioned, that of his latest murder, the death of the movie stand-in Viv, played by Moira Shearer, who was, at the time, probably the most famous member of the cast. Shearer had already worked with Powell on the movies The Red Shoes and The Tales of Hoffman, and her casting here as the victim of a psychopathic director feels like a meta-commentary on Powell's previous movies. In The Red Shoes, she played a dancer who had to sacrifice everything for her art, and here she plays a struggling actress dreaming of stardom. So there is certainly a commentary here on the destructive nature of artistic dreams and ambition. Her death is perhaps the most elaborately choreographed of the whole film, quite literally in this case, as she dances around the film studio while Mark sets up his murderous film set, filling the audience with anxiety as we contemplate what might be to come. No longer the innocent that he is when he is with Helen, Mark here is genuinely terrifying, preparing the set and his camera and positioning Vivian in various poses as he waits to film what I guess we can describe as the money shot. When he approaches her and reveals that his murder weapon is in fact his camera, the leg of which has been adapted to house a wickedly sharp blade, our hearts are as high in our throats as the blade is positioned against hers. And yet, audiences of the time must have doubted that such a major star would meet such a grisly end. This was, of course, 2 months before Psycho rewrote the rules of horror cinema, and Shearer's name and photographs had been used in the publicity to a much greater extent than any of the other actors. It was perhaps lucky for Hitchcock, then, that Powell's film did not get the wide release that it truly deserved, because in killing Moira Shearer midway through the movie, Powell managed to beat Hitch to the punch by at least 2 months. The idea of a camera being a murder weapon is again a commentary on the nature of filmmaking. But this murder, horrible as it is, does at least give us a darkly comedic moment, as the young actress who had been unable to fade convincingly on cue faints dead away when the body is discovered. And this leads to another frustrated proclamation from the director of the film within a film, who moans that she did it before the cameras were even rolling. But there is much more to it than this. That Mark murders somebody to whom he can easily be connected, and that he clumsily hides her body on the set of the film on which he is working, is evidence that he, like many killers, desperately wants someone to stop him. This is made apparent in his conversation with a psychiatrist called in to help with the police investigation, and then even more so when he commits his final murder, that of the artist model Millie, who he kills knowing that he is being followed by the police. This leads us to the climax of the movie, where Helen discovers the nature of Mark's crimes when she innocently switches on his projector in his absence. Backing away in horror, she backs into Mark as he returns from his final murder. But even then, knowing what he is, she cannot help but love him, begging him to tell her that the film she has seen must have been faked, and wanting to help him despite all that she now knows. It is tragic, moving, and also quite horrible, and once again we fear for her safety as he reveals the blade hidden in his camera, and we finally see the distorting mirror with which he forces his victims to watch their own deaths. Even then, though, we cannot help but feel pity as he takes his own life in front of her, with a succession of flashbulbs exploding as he photographs his own demise, the ultimate voyeur and the ultimate director, right to the very end. Peeping Tom premiered before an audience of critics and specially invited guests at the Plaza Cinema in Piccadilly, London in May 1960. In the 1997 documentary, A Very British Psycho, Karl Böhm, who had hoped that the film would make him an international star, recalled the experience. Quote, "The first time I remember seeing it was when I came to London for the official opening. What then happened, I can never forget in my life. There were some very famous people invited as honoured guests, and Mickey Powell and myself, we stood outside in the foyer. When the film finished, there was an absolute deadly silence. We stood there, and the doors opened, and first at the doors were the honoured guests. Then they came down and walked towards us, and suddenly they turned to the left and went outside without even looking at us, without shaking hands. Oh, well, forget that. They weren't even looking at us. We were speechless. We looked at each other. We waited until somebody at least would comment. But nothing. End quote. And of course, we all now know what happened next. 2 months later, Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho, a film with which Peeping Tom is often compared. Perhaps having learned a lesson from what happened to his friend Michael Powell, Hitchcock refused to hold any critic preview screenings, instead opting for a wider release that allowed audiences to make up their own minds about his film and its content. Hitchcock, of course, was a far more powerful and popular director than Michael Powell, and he had absolute control of his publicity, swearing audiences to secrecy and insisting that theatres were not allowed to admit latecomers. All of this helped enormously with the film's word of mouth, which is possibly one reason why the bad reviews, of which there were many when they finally appeared, were not as damaging to his film as they had been to Powell's. And so, for a while at least, Peeping Tom disappeared into relative obscurity, while Psycho became hailed as the film which changed the shape of horror forever. Given that Peeping Tom is arguably a more psychologically complex and multi-dimensional film than Psycho, I wonder whether this would have been the case had the British critics been kinder. But I guess we'll never know. As I mentioned at the start of this episode, the legend is that Peeping Tom destroyed Michael Powell's career, and it's certainly true that the director himself held that opinion. But he did continue to direct afterwards. In 1961, he directed a film called The Queen's Guards, starring Raymond Massey and his son, Anna's brother Daniel. He followed this with a film shot in West Germany called Bluebeard's Castle, an Australian film called They Are a Weird Mob, and in 1969 a romantic comedy called Age of Consent, starring James Mason and Helen Mirren in her first major screen role. In 1972, he directed a children's film called The Boy Who Turned Yellow, and then, in 1978, he made a documentary for the BBC. This was called Return to the Edge of the World, and in this, he and the surviving members of the cast and crew of his 1937 movie The Edge of the World returned to the island on which that film had been made. And then something rather unusual and unexpected happened. Peeping Tom found a somewhat unlikely champion in the shape of Martin Scorsese. The American director had grown up watching Powell's early movies and had admired him from a very young age. He then met Powell in 1975, and the two became friends. But more than just friendship, Scorsese was a huge admirer of Peeping Tom, which had, to be fair, had a much better critical reception overseas than it had had in the UK. For him, Peeping Tom is not so much about a killer and more about the idea of filmmaking, something that he would explain in an interview given in 2010 when he compared it very favourably to Federico Fellini's film about filmmaking, 8½. Quote, I have always felt that Peeping Tom and 8½, say everything that can be said about filmmaking and the process of dealing with film, the objectivity and subjectivity of it, and the confusion between the two. 8½ captures the glamour and enjoyment of filmmaking, while Peeping Tom shows the aggression of it, how the camera violates. From studying them, you can discover everything about people who make films, or at least people who express themselves through films. End quote. In 1979, he purchased Peeping Tom and arranged for a screening at the New York Film Festival, where it was seen for the first time by fellow film luminaries, including Francis Ford Coppola and Brian De Palma. And so Peeping Tom, after nearly 2 decades of relative obscurity, suddenly got the opening it truly deserved. The reception at the New York Film Festival was rapturous, and as is always the way with such things, this led to a critical re-evaluation of both Powell and his most controversial film. In 1982, Francis Ford Coppola invited Michael Powell to be a director in residence at his Zoetrope studios in California, and there Powell, quote-unquote, potted around and began to write his autobiography. In 1984, Powell married editor Thelma Shoemaker, and the two remained married until Powell's death from cancer in February 1990 at the age of 85. It's heartening to know that he lived long enough to see the film's critical re-evaluation, but unfortunately he didn't live long enough to see his biggest critic of the time pull a complete 180. This was the critic Dilys Powell, whom in 1960 had been the critic for the Sunday Times, a position which saw her as one of the most powerful critics in the UK. At the time of Peeping Tom's release, she called it nauseating, vicious and sadistic, but she would publicly recant her opinion in an article published after Powell's death in 1994. Quote, Michael Powell has long been one of this country's most distinguished filmmakers. But when, in 1960, he made a horror film, I hated the piece, and together with a great many other critics said so. Today, I find I am convinced that it is a masterpiece. If, in some afterlife, conversation is permitted, I shall think it my duty to seek out Michael Powell and apologise. End quote. As I mentioned earlier, it is probably too easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to condemn those critics of 1960 for their blinkered short-sightedness and the fact that they condemned a film now considered a masterpiece to a temporary grave. But placing ourselves in their shoes for a moment, it is easy to see why they reacted as they did. Nothing like this had ever been seen in cinemas before. The dark psychology, the subjective camera work, the depiction of sex, pornography and violence, and importantly, the insistence on empathy for a man who we know from the outset is a killer. It may have less bloodshed in it than there is in Psycho, but Peeping Tom is arguably a far more disturbing movie. It is more complex, more upsetting, and never lets the audience off the hook for even a second. All of these are, of course, things that horror fans, including myself, now celebrate, but we do indeed live in different times. But I have to admit, while I admire Peeping Tom greatly, particularly its cinematography, performances, and the multi-layered nature of its storytelling, it is not a film that I return to all that often. And this is because the overarching emotion I take from it is not horror or fear, but instead pity and a feeling of great sadness, which is, of course, a sign of how impactful a film it really is. As we heard earlier, the film critic for the Evening Standard, Alexander Walker, said that his first experience of seeing Peeping Tom was like being hit with the world's first snuff movie. And our second film this week is in fact about that very subject, along with several other things. So before we get onto that film, which is Tesis from 1996, I thought I would take a very brief detour and discuss the history of snuff films in mainstream cinema. It's probably appropriate to start at the beginning, with the film that introduced the cinematic term snuff into the mainstream. This was a movie that was originally called The Slaughter, an incredibly low-budget Z-list film shot in Argentina by a couple of New York-based exploitation filmmakers called Michael and Roberta Findlay. They first met at the City College of New York and then subsequently married, and they then began making exploitation films together, with Roberta serving as cinematographer, writer, editor, and occasional actress, and Michael handling the writing and directing. Their movies fall into a category that is known colloquially as quote-unquote roughies, cheap and rather nasty horror films that combined conventional stories with sadomasochistic sex scenes, and they largely played on the grindhouse cinema circuit. Titles from the couple include Body of a Female in 1964, The Sin Syndicate in 1965, and a 1965 film called Satan's Bed, which is probably only notable for the fact that it starred Yoko Ono in her acting debut, 3 years before she met the Beatles' John Lennon. Their main breakthrough, though, if we can call it that, was a trio of films known as the Flesh Trilogy, The Touch of Her Flesh in 1967, and The Curse of Her Flesh and The Kiss of Her Flesh, which were both released in 1968. In 1971, they decided to produce a cash-in on the Manson murders. Well, they don't call it exploitation for nothing. So they decided to make a film called The Slaughter, a movie that has been described by the writer Kim Newman as, quote, an incredibly dire and excruciatingly dull movie about a Charles Manson type called Sultan, who orders his girlfriends to kill some movie makers, end quote. Newman also went on to describe the film as being, quote, so cheap that the police investigation of the crimes is conducted from a desk plonked, Monty Python style, in a farmyard, and the 5 minutes worth of plot is padded out with endless footage of the girls posing in now outdated gear, like flowery dresses and bee-eye sunglasses. The violence is far too mild to relieve the tedium, end quote. Not surprisingly, the film was not particularly well received by its potential distributors, and it sat unreleased on the shelf for several years until it was rediscovered by a sexploitation film producer called Alan Shackleton. In 1975, Shackleton had read some newspaper articles about rumours of so-called snuff films being made in South America, films in which people were tortured and killed for real. Smelling some money in the making, Shackleton then filmed a different ending for the Findlays movie, in which the actress supposedly playing the lead became so aroused by the violence that the quote-unquote director seduces her, attacks her, and then disembowels her. And all of this, by the way, is performed by extras who were apparently barely able to contain their embarrassment or their suppressed laughter. None of the original actors from The Slaughter appear in this sequence, but Shackleton simply assumed that no one would really care or be able to tell the difference. He then began an aggressive marketing campaign, retitling the film Snuff and accompanying it with the tagline, quote, the film that could only be made in South America, where life is cheap, end quote. He also hired fake protesters to picket movie theatres showing the film, creating a media frenzy, and commentators and genuinely concerned citizens began to join the protests. And although it was exposed as a hoax in Variety shortly after its release, the controversy did lead to some commercial success in major US cities, like New York, where in some theatres it even outgrossed the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So I guess there really is no accounting for taste, or indeed the total absence of it. I've never seen the film, and nor would I ever want to, but as writer Kim Newman put it, quote, this hoax deserves its place in film history as an example of the appalling contempt some people in the business have for their audiences. As well as assuming that the world is full of bloodthirsty people who want to see a genuine murder on screen, Snuff insults the 4 people out there who had been interested in the plot of The Slaughter. The additional scene replaces the original ending, so we never find out whether Sultan or his girls get what they deserve, end quote. Regardless, although rumours of so-called snuff films have been circulating since at least the early 1970s, the film's notoriety and publicity pushed the term into mainstream culture, and the concept became the central conceit of several films that followed. In 1979, the sometimes talented and always obnoxious Paul Schrader released Hardcore, a neo-noir crime drama starring George C. Scott. In this, he plays a businessman whose teenage daughter goes missing and who then heads to California to look for her, finding himself falling headfirst into a subculture of violent pornography and snuff movies. The film received mixed reviews, the most positive of which concerned Scott's performance and Schrader's direction, while the most negative focused on what was seen as a disappointing ending. Interestingly, given his earlier comments, one of the more favourable reviews in the UK came from Alexander Walker of the Evening Standard, who said, quote, Hardcore remains a movie that arouses thought, never mind anything else, by confronting what many will find the unacceptable face of current cinema, end quote. In the same year, director Terence Young, who we mentioned earlier, released the film Bloodline, based on a novel by Sidney Sheldon and starring Audrey Hepburn in her only R-rated film. This story follows a pharmaceutical heiress played by Audrey Hepburn who is targeted for death by unknown members of her family, while a serial killer is simultaneously crossing Europe and murdering women in snuff films. Sidney Sheldon is, in my opinion, a bloody terrible writer, and it sounds like Bloodline is also a rather terrible film. Made on a budget of $12 million, it grossed only $8.2 million at the American box office. And when describing it in his review, the critic Roger Ebert wrote, quote, "After 6 months, a week and 2 days of suspense, we can now all relax. The worst movie of 1979 has opened. See Sidney Sheldon's Bloodline and weep for the cinema." End quote. Other reviews, if you can believe it, were even less favourable, and to be honest, I don't really think we're going to see a Peeping Tom style revival anytime soon. Moving on to 1983, we have Videodrome from director David Cronenberg, starring James Woods before he started chewing the scenery on set and later doing far, far worse off it. In this, he plays an incredibly sleazy TV executive searching for extreme programming. In his investigations, he stumbles across Videodrome, a pirate broadcast that apparently consists of genuine murder and torture. It's a great film, bloody strange, and of course being Cronenberg, it is far less about snuff movies and more about conspiracy, mind control, madness, body horror, and hallucinatory special effects. And Special Effects is the name of our next film, which was directed by Larry Cohen and released a year later in 1984. This features a film director who murders his lover, played by cult actress Zoe Lund, and accidentally catches the murder on camera. Given that the filming of it is accidental rather than deliberate, I'm not sure it entirely qualifies, but it is worth a mention here, as much like our first film, Peeping Tom, it is also a commentary on filmmaking and the nature of directing as much as it is a thriller. And then in 1995, 2 films were released that deal with the topic to a greater or lesser extent. The first of these is Mute Witness, a British-German co-production from director Anthony Walker, and the second is Strange Days, a US production produced and written by James Cameron and directed by Catherine Bigelow. Mute Witness is about a mute makeup artist working on a low-budget horror film in Russia who is accidentally locked in the studio and witnesses, hence the name, a snuff film being shot after hours. Featuring a cameo from the legendary actor Sir Alec Guinness, it's a rather entertaining and suspenseful comedy horror, and it received positive reviews from critics before it seemingly disappeared. More recently, it has experienced something of a revival, and in fact was actually going to be the second pairing in this week's double bill before I settled on Thesis instead. Meanwhile, Strange Days is a futuristic sci-fi neo-noir starring Ralph Fiennes and Juliette Lewis, and is about a black market electronic device that records the memories and physical sensations of the wearer. Its complex plot centers around the recording of a brutal murder, while it also makes several points about power, voyeurism, activism, and racism. It was not at all well received on its initial release, and it nearly derailed Catherine Bigelow's career, but she has since gone on to call it one of her most personal films, describing it as, quote, a synthesis of all the different tracks I've been exploring, either deliberately or unconsciously, ever since I started making art, end quote. Much like Mute Witness, it has gone on to be rediscovered and re-evaluated, and sadly has particular relevance these days with our world of constant monitoring and recording, and authoritarianism, cultural violence, and systemic racism. But the snuff film wasn't just gaining a foothold as a theme for mainstream cinema. It was also beginning to be studied in academia, or perhaps more precisely, the impact of such films was being studied, which isn't really the same thing. In 1989, renowned Spanish writer, essayist, and film historian Roman Gubern published a book called The Pornographic Image and Other Optical Perversions. This work explores the historical lineage of pornography from 19th century photography to modern film and video, and explicitly discusses snuff films in its final chapter, calling them the final stage of violent death turned into spectacle. Böhm goes on to say that they represent the most extreme cases of sadistic scopophilia, but he also points out, quite correctly, that such spectacles are actually nothing new. Dating back to the gladiators of Rome, the crowds at the guillotine during the French Revolution, public executions across the globe, and other spectacles of real human suffering, man, well, some men at least, has enjoyed the torment and anguish of others for centuries. It's just that technology can now present it in a very different form. As he puts it in his final chapter, what they are is essentially a return to collective sadistic gratification, and you only have to look at some of the reels posted on TikTok these days to see that he probably had a point. This chapter was the first time that the concept of snuff movies had been written about in the context of Spanish film and media studies, and as such it served as the initial inspiration for our second film of the week, when it was read at university by a young student and novice filmmaker called Alejandro Amenábar. All of which does indeed bring us on to our second film of the week, which is 1996's Tesis or Thesis. It was, as you have just heard, directed by Alejandro Amenábar, and it stars Ana Torrent, Eduardo Noriega, Fele Martínez, and Nieves Herranz. Alejandro Amenábar was born in Santiago, Chile in 1972 to a Spanish mother and a Chilean father, and he was a year old when his family moved to Spain. An incredibly creative child, he rarely watched television and spent much of his time reading and writing stories, as well as playing the guitar and keyboards. As many of you will know, he has in fact written the scores for almost every feature he has directed, including Thesis, and he has also composed for other directors as well. Gifted, or perhaps cursed, with a very vivid imagination, Amenábar has recalled that he was very easily frightened as a young boy, describing himself as a scaredy-cat kid who, quote, couldn't walk through a corridor without my family being close to me, end quote. Interestingly enough, though, what helped him overcome this was his first introduction to horror. With no cinema near the family home, and with parents who limited television viewing, his first real encounters with film came through some neighbours, an American Spanish family called the Smiths. The Smith family home became what he later called his video club, with he, his brother, and the Smiths' own children watching every type of genre imaginable, including, of course, horror films. Quote, as a scaredy-cat kid, my parents wouldn't let me watch horror movies, but I was lucky or unlucky that my neighbours did watch them and showed me the films my parents wouldn't have let me see. I saw The Exorcist, Alien, The Changeling, and through being scared, I don't know if it was shock therapy, but I managed to free myself from my inner fears. End quote. He would later say that cinema saved his life, and it also helped him develop his storytelling technique, as he would entertain small groups during recess at school the next day, telling them about the films that he had seen, and telling them his own stories too. But it wasn't just horror that he was exposed to. At the age of 15, he began going to the cinema with his brother Roberto, building on the passion that he had begun to develop. He supplemented these experiences with more films on home video, where he encountered directors including Spielberg, Hitchcock, Kubrick, James Cameron, and Orson Welles. He later said that his key cinematic influences are Spielberg, Kubrick, and Hitchcock, and we can certainly see the influence of the last of these in his debut film Thesis. At home, he would continue writing stories and composing music to accompany them, but as he had no way of recording these, they remained very much private projects. In 1990, he began starring at the Complutense University of Madrid, enrolling in Image and Sound Studies in the Faculty of Information Sciences, which was the closest that he could come to attending an actual film school at the time. Soon afterwards, he persuaded his father to buy him a video camera, and he began working on a short film with 3 friends. At this point, he didn't even have a script, he said, going on to explain that what he was trying to do was tell a story using only images. And so, more often than not, he would find himself writing the things that they were going to film on the very same day that they were going to film them. He later described this process as an incredibly valuable education, saying, quote, "I think that making shorts is a very useful learning experience because no matter how much you have read or heard, the moment you see how filmmaking works, the moment you have to give instructions to the actors, and the moment you edit the images, you start to see what works and what doesn't." End quote. His next film was called Hymenoptera and can be seen as a prototype for Tesis, as he has described it as a film about violence in images, made with the intention of making the viewer think about how intense and how gross an image could or should be. But owning a camera and working on short films also made a big difference to his academic career. He has said that he had been a very good student up to that point, but that he began to find university too detached from the reality of actually making films. He soon found himself skipping classes, preferring to spend his time studying what he really wanted to study through his own self-led classes, working with the camera. And so he considers himself self-taught and says that the combination of watching movies and working with the camera helped him to hone his craft. But he does also say that university was an important part of his life. It was where he developed friendships that he has maintained to this day, including with his early collaborator Matteo Hill, with whom he would work on his short films and also on the script for Tesis. He began entering his shorts into contests, using his prize money to upgrade his camera. But more importantly, Hymenoptera attracted the attention of film producer and director Jose Luis Cerda, who invited Amenábar to his studio and suggested that he should make a feature. As we have heard, for his shorts, Amenábar essentially worked with no screenplay, coming up with dialogue and ideas very much on the hoof on the day of filming, and so he wasn't initially sure whether he had it in him to actually write a feature. Nevertheless, he and Matteo Hill began working together to create what would eventually become Tesis. And now we are getting into the spoilers, and so once again, all usual warnings apply from this point forward. Adhering to the adage of write what you know, he decided to set his film at a university, and his actual university would eventually serve as the location for filming. But university provided more than the setting for his film and an introduction to his co-writer. It was here that he encountered the book by Roman Gobern and his final chapter on the pernicious impact of the snuff movie. At the time, the idea of snuff movies was seen as something of an urban legend, something so outlandish that it could not possibly be real. As Amenábar described it, quote, "Film is a flexible medium. It is easy to simulate a death on film, which is partly why people believe in the existence of snuff films. They see simulated deaths and believe they are genuine. I think it is possible that they exist, but whether they exist or not is less important than people believing in their existence. It is the will to believe in an evil fantasy. That is what makes the myth interesting." End quote. As I think we now know, there are unfortunately people who do indeed make and distribute such content, though as technology has now moved on, the presence of such material is now more online than on video, an idea which forms the basis of the highly disturbing but nonetheless excellent Canadian movie Red Rooms from 2023. But although the idea of the snuff movie serves as the mechanism for the story, Amenábar was keen to avoid using it as anything more than that. His film is less about snuff than it is about the power of images in society, and he went on to say that, as he didn't want to give the idea any form of publicity, the idea of a snuff movie is only mentioned twice in the script. In this sense, the snuff movie in Tesis is what Alfred Hitchcock called the MacGuffin, the plot device that motivates the characters and exists to drive the story forward. As Hitchcock himself put it, quote, "It is the thing that the characters on the screen worry about, but the audience doesn't care." End quote. And so, much like the Falcon in The Maltese Falcon, or the 39 Steps in Hitchcock's film of the same name, the MacGuffin, in this case a snuff movie, is largely irrelevant for the majority of the film. It may propel the narrative, But what we are really interested in is the investigation, the dynamics between the characters, and the detective story with which we are being presented. As such, the violent images from the videotape are shown quite sparingly, and the images presented are essentially fragments, often with only a small part of the frame shown. The central character of the film is Angela, a PhD student who is writing her thesis on violent images in the media. This conceit allows Amenábar to focus on the subtext of his movie, which is the presentation of violence on Spanish television, which had reached fever pitch in the 1990s due to the rise of privately funded TV networks. He later said that, at the time, quote, "We had some very, very, very nasty cases of violence. And I remember there were shows on TV which weren't very respectful. The treatment wasn't good. They were just trying to get your attention. Actually, now even that has been surpassed. So nobody really cares when you see something really, really bad on TV. And there are people really taking advantage of that morbid attitude from viewers. And actually, that was the criticism. It was about some TV shows which were making profit from tragedy." End quote. However, while this is certainly a theme of the movie, at no point does Amenábar adopt the patronising "you are all complicit" approach that Michael Haneke attempted a year later with his absurdly hypocritical film Funny Games. He has said that although he wanted his film to have different levels, and that he knew he was playing with a very tough subject, he also wanted to ensure that his audience had fun. Angela is a very complex character. She is both attracted by death and also repelled by it. And this is something that is demonstrated within the film's opening moments, as a train that she is on is stopped following a suicide on the tracks, and she goes against the instructions of the railway staff to see if she can take a closer look. We see this again later when she discovers her professor, Figueroa, dead in the university projection room, and reaches out to touch his face with a mixture of fascination and repulsion instead of calling for assistance. She is played by Ana Torrent, who had found success in Spain as a child actor when she starred in a 1973 film called The Spirit of the Beehive, a critique of the Franco era in which she played a young girl obsessed with the 1931 version of Frankenstein. This, along with her large and penetrating eyes, makes her casting in the film incredibly appropriate, and she was suggested by producer Jose Luis Cerda. Of her introduction to the film, she later said, quote, "My agent called me and told me it had been written by a student who hadn't finished his degree. It was a thriller, a genre that wasn't being made in Spain, low budget, that would be filmed in 5 weeks, and there were no well-known names involved. I read it in one sitting, and when I met Alejandro, I was blown away by how clear his vision was." End quote. And her performance is very effective, depicting Angela's morbid curiosity and her attraction to and revulsion from the images that we are seeing, including, as we just mentioned, the dead body of her college professor. As the character with whom we spend most of our time, she becomes the eyes and ears of the audience, though for some this may prove to be a somewhat frustrating experience. Certainly, her decisions at times had me shouting internally at the screen the first time I saw the film. Her investigation is hardly subtle, particularly when she is initially attempting to shadow her chief suspect. She stays in dangerous places when she should be heading for the hills, and when she does run, it is into empty spaces when she should be staying with the crowd. And when she loses her keys while being pursued by someone she believes to be a killer, she tells no one in her family and doesn't even bother to suggest that it would be prudent to have all of the locks changed. Of course, this is a staple of the thriller genre, and it also shows her naivety of the world in which she has found herself, but it is a bit of a frustrating watch nonetheless. Angela's professor dies after watching a videotape he found in a hidden room in the university's archive, where he had been trying to find some material to help with her thesis. Driven by morbid curiosity, Angela steals the tape from the screening room. But before she does this, she has already enlisted the help of another student called Chema. Chema later becomes her partner in her investigation, and also, in true Hitchcock fashion, also becomes a suspect as the narrative progresses. Chema, as played by Fele Martínez, is a fan of extreme film and horror cinema, and his shabby apartment, which he has taken over from his dead grandmother, is a veritable treasure trove of cinematic Easter eggs, with posters for Clive Barker's Nightbreed and Hellraiser decorating the walls. This is in very sharp contrast to Angela, whose bedroom at home, where she still lives with her parents, is decorated with a poster for Gus Van Sant's art house movie, My Own Private Idaho. Agreeing to Angela's request to show her violent images, what Chema initially placed for her is a Mondo movie called Fresh Blood, similar to Faces of Death, which we briefly discussed last week. How horrible, she says. Do people really watch these movies? Yes, he replies. You, for instance. That's different, she retorts. I don't enjoy them. It's disgusting. And yet, she also cannot tear her eyes from the screen. Martinez, who had been in Madrid studying theatre for only a year at the time, recalled that his initial audition didn't go particularly well. Quote, "They told me they were sending me a script and I didn't know what it was. I did terribly on the audition. I was very nervous and they let me do it again. And then Alejandro took a chance on me." End quote. And a very wise move, as it turns out. Chema, who is based on one of the director's real-life university friends, is initially what one might consider a gorehound, though as the story progresses, it is clear that he is a far more rounded character than just that. He is initially wary of Angela's request for assistance, until he has a change of heart in the lunchroom, depicted by a superbly choreographed scene where he and Angela's points of view are accompanied by the music that they are listening to on their personal stereos, metal and classical, respectively. His down-to-earth pragmatism also acts as a sharp contrast to Angela's naivety, and I found myself rooting for him a little more than I did our supposed heroine. And so, when it is revealed at the film's midpoint that he may be a suspect in the murder shown on the stolen videotape, it feels like the ultimate betrayal. If he is a killer, he is certainly a perverse one, as it is he who reveals the first clues that lead Angela deeper into her investigation. The first of these is that the girl on the tape is someone he recognizes, a girl who went missing from the university 3 years before. The second is the camera used to film the actual footage, which he identifies through the digital fingerprints on the recording itself. The film, he concludes, must have been shot on a specific Sony camera, an XT500, which was the very same model that Amenábar used to film his movie, Hymenoptera. This discovery leads Angela to another suspect, who she sees using the very same make and model of camera to record a girl in the university lunchroom. We eventually discover that his name is Bosco, a name shared with a character in Amenábar's Hymenoptera, and he becomes the very definition of the term homme fatale. Dangerously seductive and charming, classically good-looking and well-dressed, he presents a sharp contrast to Chema's more grungy aesthetic, and he initially becomes Angela's and our chief suspect. And these suspicions cause Angela to behave in the rather frustrating manner to which I alluded before. She stares pointedly at him as he records the girl in the lunchroom, and then very unsubtly attempts to shadow him, leading to a chase sequence through the university when he turns the tables and begins to follow her instead. This in turn leads to a confrontation where she demonstrates that she is as bad at lying as she is at tailing suspects, and in which he reveals that not only has he noticed her stalking him, but that he also knew the supposedly missing former student. He soon worms his way into Angela's school and personal life, turning up unannounced at her home, where he stays for dinner and begins to flirt with her younger sister, Senna. But more than just a suspect, Bosco also represents Angela's internal conflict. She is both drawn to him and afraid of him, something that is revealed in a nightmare sequence where he cuts her neck with a switchblade while simultaneously seducing her. Later in the film, we even see her stroke and kiss his recorded image playing on a TV screen, a nice counterpoint to stroking her dead professor's face earlier in the movie, underlining the fact that she might well be attracted to death itself. Bosco is played by Eduardo Noriega, who had already appeared in Amenábar's short movies. But before his final casting in the film, both he and the director were concerned that, being an unknown, he might not be considered suitable for the role. As he said later, quote, "Alejandro thought of me because we had made short films together, but he warned me that Cuerda might want famous names. But I think the producer was happy with Ana and then accepted Fele and me, who were complete unknowns. I think Cuerda's success was bringing together three inexperienced people with experienced and highly regarded professionals." End quote. One of these professionals was the actor Xavier Elorriaga, who enters the story as another possible suspect. This is a substitute professor named Castro, brought in to replace the late Professor Figueroa, and he is introduced to the class by a character played in a cameo by producer Jose Luis Cuerda. And much as Peeping Tom contains some pithy observations about the state of British filmmaking, Professor Castro's presence also allows Amenábar to indulge in some commentary about the state of Spanish cinema. As regular listeners will know, this was not in the best shape in the early 1990s, at least as far as genre movies were concerned. And so, lecturing his students, cigarette in hand, Castro tells them, quote, "What is the cinema? Don't fool yourselves. The cinema is an industry. It's about money. Millions invested in films and then made at the box office. Our country has no cinema because there's no concept of industry. No communication between the makers and their audience. We've reached a very critical stage. Our cinema won't be saved unless it is understood as an industrial phenomena. As students of cinema, you are the future of Spanish cinema. Save it. The American industry's out there trampoline on you, and there's only one way to compete. Give the public what it wants. Don't forget that." End quote. Amenábar has said that this speech reflects the thoughts of his generation at the time, filmmakers who wanted to make more commercial movies. This is, of course, what Alex de la Iglesia was also doing with his Goya-winning film The Day of the Beast, and the success of Iglesias' films and Tesis would indeed open the door for a new wave of commercial Spanish genre cinema. This, though, is where the similarities end. Where de la Iglesias' films are an adrenaline rush of Spanish anarchy, Amenábar's debut was influenced far more by American filmmaking. As well as Hitchcock, he has cited that Tesis also owes a debt to Michael Crichton's excellent 1978 thriller Coma, and also Brian De Palma's not quite so excellent Dressed to Kill. Whether seasoned professional like Ana Torrent or novice performer like Noriega or Martinez, Amenábar treated his actors very much the same, in a manner which suggests he had taken his love of Hitchcock a little too far, at the time at least. As you may know, one of Hitchcock's most famous quotes was that actors should be treated like cattle, and Amenábar took a similar approach, insisting that scenes be performed in a very exacting manner that must have driven his cast to distraction. They later recalled a mirroring exercise that he used to insist on, where they would have to copy the movements he demonstrated exactly. In a behind-the-scenes documentary, we also see him insist on multiple takes for Torrent to deliver one line, actually one word of dialogue, until it meets his exacting standards. It might not have been at the David Fincher or Stanley Kubrick levels of perfectionism, but it certainly seems to have come close. He said since that he has relaxed his approach greatly since then, which is of course the benefit of having greater experience. Because, to be fair to Amenábar, he was directing his first feature at the age of just 23, and the experience must have been daunting. With only 5 weeks to film, the pressure was certainly on. He also had no experience of directing professional actors, and he later admitted that he was terrified that the crew wouldn't listen to him. Fortunately, producer Cuerda surrounded him with seasoned talent, most notably the cinematographer Hans Berman, who had begun his career in 1965. It is Berman who lit and photographed the film's most visually arresting moments, from the tracking and god shots inside the university to the eerily lit sequence where Angela and Kemmer are walking through the tunnels beneath the university, lit only by a match. Once Professor Castro, Bosco, and Bosco's girlfriend Yolanda have been introduced, we begin a cat and mouse game as to who is behind the movie and the identity of the faceless killer on the tape. And rather unusually for this podcast, I'm not going to reveal any more. So those of you who haven't seen the film and have ignored my spoiler warnings can still enjoy trying to work it out. Needless to say, the solution involves even more questionable actions from Angela, but it also involves a climax which for me slips a little bit too far into generic Hollywood territory. Not so much in the solution, but in the fact that it takes place during an electrical storm. For me, it just feels a little bit too cliché. But without spoiling too much, we can discuss the final shots of the movie, which show a succession of Spanish citizens glued to their TV sets as a news program plays the most outrageous of images. This speaks to Amenábar's previously mentioned concerns about the then state of Spanish television, something that we could essentially call the film's own thesis. And this is something that was outlined very heavily in the press book that was created to support the film's release. Quote, Tesis is a story about TV violence, pornography, and the snuff movie as the ultimate manifestation of terror in cinema. The progressive demystification of old social taboos, for example sex, pain, and death, and their transmission by the mass media make their visual treatment in film very difficult. To call the public's attention to these matters is not easy in a media culture where everything has already been shown. For this reason, we chose the opposite course, to show nothing. The public will see the protagonists looking at images in an almost pathological mood, but the images will never be seen on screen. The public, for whom these images are the main source of interest, is thereby punished, but this punishment is compensated for by a script full of tricks and designed for entertainment. However, at several points, the film script also invites subtle reflection on the future of the audiovisual market, on the pressure of the American movie industry, the main example of movies dominated by economic interests, the growing diffusion of snuff movies on video circuits, the legitimization of violence in TV news, the dominance of images over words, the individualization of the public by means of TV and video, and their desensitization and loss of contact with reality. We think that Tesis is an interesting and necessary movie, due to the fact that it is one of the first films about snuff movies, and also because its style, dramatic and frenetic simultaneously, is very rare in the Spanish movie industry. End quote. Tesis premiered at the Berlin International Film Festival in February 1996 and it opened in Spain on the 12th of April, but its Madrid premiere was poorly attended by the film industry. Ana Torrent has recalled that another Spanish premiere happening nearby drew much of the attention, and the film was not an immediate mainstream success. Reviews were also rather mixed. El Pay, which reviewed it when it premiered in Berlin, commented on a positive festival reaction and praised Amenábar's direction, but they also felt that the script became more implausible as it went along, which, to be fair, it does a little. The Spanish publication Acclaimed was similar, noting that Amenábar made his feature film debut with aplomb, but going on to say, quote, "It is not perfect. There are ups and downs and some repetitions in the script, and the doubts surrounding Chema and Bosco's involvement in the murders are maintained in a somewhat contrived way, leaving these characters underdeveloped." End quote. However, it did also go on to say that these flaws did not stop the film from leaving a positive overall impression, calling it an important film in the renewal of narratives and filmmaking techniques in Spanish cinema. But all of this changed somewhat following the 1997 Goya Awards, at which Tesis was nominated for 8 prizes and won in all but one category, taking home Best Film, Best New Director, Best Original Screenplay, Best New Actor, Best Editing, Best Production Supervision, and Best Sound. And so, although by this stage Tesis had all but disappeared from cinemas and had earned approximately 96 million pesetas, its success at the Goyas led to an immediate revival, and the film earned a further 350 million pesetas, roughly the equivalent of 2.6 million euros, against a budget of 700,000. By this stage, Amenábar had begun work on his second production, the science fiction thriller Open Your Eyes, which reunited him with Eduardo Noriega and Fele Martínez, and also starred Penélope Cruz. Although the director has since called it his worst film, saying that it was written by teenagers who knew nothing about life, it became the second highest grossing Spanish film of the year, and was later remade in the States as Vanilla Sky, directed by Cameron Crowe and produced by and starring Tom Cruise. Perhaps more importantly, and fortunately for lovers of gothic ghost stories, this association led to Amenábar's third movie, 2001's The Others, which was co-produced by Cruise's production company and starred Nicole Kidman. Produced for a budget of $17 million, it ended up grossing $210 million, as well as leading the 16th Goya Awards with 15 nominations and 8 wins, including Best Film, Best Director, and Best Original Screenplay. I'm sure we'll be talking about this movie in a later episode at some point, so I'll say no more about it than that. He followed this with 2004's The Sea Inside, which won him his first Oscar and Golden Globe for Best Foreign Language Film, as well as dominating the international awards circuit and winning 16 Goyas. Since then, he has directed a TV series and another 5 features, including the multi-award-winning Agora, released in 2009 starring Rachel Weisz, and the interesting but rather flawed psychological drama Regression in 2015, which starred Ethan Hawke and Emma Watson. His most recent film, The Captive, which tells the story of the Spanish writer Miguel de Cervantes, was released in 2025. Peeping Tom and Tesis are both remarkably blood-free films about voyeurism, the compulsive need to look, and, to a greater or lesser extent, the idea of the snuff movie. Both also contain critiques and commentary on the film industry at the time of their respective productions. One a lament about the crass commercialization of British cinema, and the other a battle cry to move Spanish filmmaking into more commercial and accessible directions. One was met with a landslide of revulsion and horror, under which its director was very nearly buried, and the other was an award-winning phenomena that launched the career of its creator. Together, they tell the story of the cinema's changing approach to on-screen violence and the shifting tastes of the viewing audience. And whether this trajectory is a good thing or not lies very much in the eye of the beholder. Next week, we are discussing the oldest film we have covered to date, and also our very first silent movie. Well, given that I've referenced German Expressionism in pretty much every other episode this series, I thought it was time we actually talked about one. This is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920, which was directed by Robert Wiener. This stars Konrad Veidt, Werner Klaus, and Lil Dagover. Then we follow this with something a little more recent with Session 9 from 2001. This was directed by Brad Anderson and stars David Caruso, Peter Mullen, Stephen Geverden, and Josh Lucas. If you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And remember, you can email thehorrordouble@gmail.com and follow our Instagram @thehorrordouble. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.